Yeah, so my first question is, what inspired you to get into the archaeological field and why specifically Greece?
Well, I guess that's I guess that's a personal I guess that's a personal story. My parents are Greek,
Mm,
and as a child, I traveled to Greece every summer since I think 1968.
huh,
So I've been going to Greece for a long time, and so I was exposed to I was kind of exposed to archaeology uh, continuously during those during those trips.
mm,
So we went initially. I would say to to visit family and to to see our grandparents. But uh, the Our family home is on the island of Crete, and it's a very rich, of course, throughout Greece. You'll find pretty
yeah,
much the same kind of thing. It's a very rich archaeological environment, and it turned out that there were excavations going on in the vicinity of our house, and so as a child, I would go watch these
mm,
excavations, and I was fascinated by them, and I think that that was maybe the kind of living in that environment
yeah,
was the thing that attracted me the most.
yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. And throughout your field work, what would you say? I know this is obviously a very difficult question to answer, but maybe if you could talk about one or two or just a few of your most significant findings, discoveries, and it doesn't have to be it could be most significant to you and what you felt was really important to you.
Well, I think that most archaeologists would. I mean, there are, of course, archaeologists. I mean, there are archaeologists who make spectacular discoveries in terms of people's qualitative assessment or evaluation of what constitutes an interesting find or a particularly spectacular work of art, or craftsmanship, and there are those kind of stunning discoveries that are made. But I think that most field archaeologists would probably tell you that we kind of think of what we do in the field, whether it's survey or excavation or kind of material studies, that each part of that process is an important discovery in and of itself, and it's
Yeah.
really a kind of accumulation of discoveries that leads to, I think, a level of understanding, which is very exciting, and which is constantly changing, which makes it exciting. So it's not like you find something and it's new and interesting, and that's great.
Mhm.
That's always fun. We always find interesting new things, but it's coming to terms with that over a long period of time and understanding it, and sharing that in a kind of ongoing discussion that leads to kind of real discovery. I can say that the site that I'm working on now, Azoria, this archaic site in eastern Crete, is particularly exciting, I would say. We don't have any extensively excavated 6th century sites from Crete, and so this is a kind of unique find. It's an urban site. We've been able to dig public buildings as well as houses, and
Mm,
so it's a kind of critical discovery, I would say, just more broadly in terms of the archaeological record of the island, but also for the Aegean as well. The 6th century is not a period that this kind of formative period of the early Greek polis. It's not it's not something that is easily seen archaeologically throughout the entire Aegean. They're kind of hard sites are hard to recover. Now that's mostly because successful cities in the ancient Greek world were used continuously in some cases, like Athens, for example, all the way through the modern period. And so sometimes it's hard to see those early or formative phases. So we're very lucky in that respect, and I think that that would be my greatest discovery, I suppose.
yeah, yeah. And with the Azoria project, yeah, I've seen it. I've looked into it a bit, and it's very interesting. Could you? I mean, you already talked about it a lot, but could you maybe go into more depth about what it really means and about the Greek culture? Because I think it's a very interesting project. So if you feel like you have anything else you could say about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the focal points of the project has been from we've been doing this for I guess for 20 years this year. So one of the project began back in 2002, and we're still working on it. We dug in two 5-year excavation phases that have been broken up by periods of study and publication, and of course conservation, which is a major concern of ours,
Mhm.
as it is everywhere in Greece, I suppose. And But our goals were to try to understand, kind of on a stratigraphic level, that is on the site level, how the city took shape, sort of through time. So we're interested in how the early Iron Age landscape became transformed into this kind of monumental, and completely new, architectural landscape.
Mhm.
And we were interested in understanding aspects of the political economy, that is the social, political, and economic system, that might have not only been at the at the root of those changes, but also then formed the structure of the early city. So it was a kind of exploration of early Greek urbanization, and to develop models and methods that might be used in other areas of Greece in looking at the emergence of the ancient Greek city. And so, one of the remarkable things that we've done is we have a very intensive sampling protocol on site where we recover plant remains and animal bones, that allow us to look at the agro-pastoral economy, the agricultural economy,
Wow.
as as the basis for um, as the basis for the social and political organization in the city itself. And that continues to be a challenge, and it
Yeah.
continues to be the focus of the project.
Wow, that's amazing. That's an amazing way to just find stuff through animals and plants, right? Yeah, and
Right.
you touched on this a bit, but about your conservation efforts, like I've seen with with the Azoria project, or just in general, what do you and your colleagues do to like help work on cultural preservation? Because that's something that's very important to me and something that I'd like.
Right, I've noticed that from your website, and
Yeah.
that's really remarkable that you're aware and conscious of this. Well, conservation and preservation um, of monuments, of historical monuments, of the cultural heritage and cultural landscapes is, of course, has always been, of course, an interest of archaeologists. It's also, of course, you know, receiving, I would say in the last generation or so, it, 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 it's been a kind of focal point for discussions of methodology and what our, I suppose, responsibilities are when we conduct excavation, which of course is a very intrusive and even in some cases disruptive process. Um, you know, cons- conservation is a kind of complicated thing because
Yeah.
it right now, and for a very long time, it is the obligation of every archaeologist um, um, to leave the site after the intervention of excavation,
Mhm.
to leave the site in a condition that it can be then handled properly by the Greek Ministry of Culture. And that normally entails conservation. And in fact, it's an imperative. It's part of Greek law that when you excavate, you also need to be able to demonstrate that you can conduct proper archaeological, not necessarily full site preservation, but archaeological conservation, which is to stabilize what you have found. That is kind of the architectural armature of the site, and the physical topography of the site in such a way that natural and human and even animal sort of processes that will later impact that environment won't cause serious damage to what you've discovered. And there are different ways of approaching it. But one of the big challenges that we face is it's enormously time consuming, it's enormously expensive, and it requires serious engagement with the modern physical and cultural landscape, and an enormous commitment to preservation, to undertake large scale site conservation. It was common practice, I suppose, throughout the 20th century to simply to backfill sites. So archaeological sites where you could excavate, gather as archaeologists, you could excavate, gather the data that you wanted, document the remains, and then you'd literally take the back dirt from your excavation and fill in the site. I'm kind of ambivalent about that. It can, I suppose, for the short term, preserve those remains. But even with backfilling, one should prepare the site in such a way that the backfilling process can actually help preserve those remains. I mean, that's one problem, is that we don't live in a society on any level that is really prepared to preserve cultural landscapes. And I suppose that is to find funding for excavation or for archaeological research, is a challenge, but one can do it. There are lots of, in the United States, for example, there are federal grants that I apply for to conduct my work in Greece, and there are sources of private foundation money, but there are remarkably few resources available to undertake the actual expense of conducting site preservation or archaeological conservation. Very few. And those sources of funding that do exist are not prepared for the actual costs that are involved. Even for an average size site, you're talking about amounts in hundreds of thousands of dollars over long periods of time, and funding agencies, even philanthropic foundations whose goal is to preserve sites, aren't prepared for that kind of continuous long-term expenditure. And the other big piece of it is that archaeological preservation of archaeological landscapes goes hand in hand with preservation of natural landscapes, and traditional landscapes, traditional cultural and historical landscapes. And again, we live in a society that's very presentist. We live in a society that's, and in a global, neoliberal capitalist system that doesn't really concern itself with and doesn't want to be impeded by any kind of attention to the preservation of natural, traditional, historical, or archaeological environments. I mean, they're just not interested. So it's a real challenge.
And I think what you said about the environmental aspect, that's something that I hadn't really thought about that much. That's really important to think about.
I mean, archaeological sites exist, in our present cultural landscape. Those archaeological sites don't belong to the past. They actually belong to the present, and the archaeologist only facilitates kind of bringing them more close and into direct physical contact and interface with our everyday lives and our everyday activities, which are agricultural, which are that have to do with, that are also impinge upon economic development, the building of houses, the building of hotels, the building of swimming pools, the the uh, the kind of the kind of expected transformation of the physical landscape that we associate with economic development.
Mm,
And in many ways, the two are kind of in opposition. And in order for us to really preserve not only the archaeological landscape, but the natural landscape, we need to find a way of connecting those two and mediating that conflict.
mhm, yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, there aren't archaeologists, and the government won't always be there, right? And as you know better than me, for sure, Greece has so many artifacts and monuments everywhere. Like every corner you turn, every island has hundreds, if not thousands, of artifacts. And well, what my question is what can the average person in one of these communities who's not trained as an archaeologist or not trained by the government, what can they do to help preserve their own culture in their own community?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot that they can do. It is hard. You can't, it's very difficult it's very difficult. I think it's difficult to legislate. I mean, the Greek ministry, the archaeological directorate, and the directorate of conservation of the Greek Ministry of Culture, they have a real challenge because they can, through legislation, through policy, through laws, they can kind of control, impede, and I should say probably help mediate this interaction between people's everyday economic lives, and the preservation, the documentation and preservation of cultural heritage, and archaeological remains. But it's really hard to do because of what you just said, just the sheer density of archaeological remains in the landscape means that, in theory, one like couldn't do anything in the modern economic world without without somehow impinging on ancient landscapes, because those ancient landscapes exist in our present environment, and we need to somehow find a way of confronting that. There are things that communities are doing today in Greece that I think are very productive. The village where I work on Crete, the village of Kabusi, its cultural or its local cultural organization, the Politisiko Syllogos,
Mhm.
and the local kinotita, the local
Mm.
I guess town government,
Yeah,
as
the
you
people.
probably
Yeah.
translated, as well as the demos, uh, are, I think, very interested in encouraging the preservation and, in fact, impeding or at least slowing, and more carefully engaging with individuals' interests in economic development. And one strategy that they've used toward the preservation of their own traditional and archaeological and historical landscapes has been to demonstrate to developers, to demonstrate to their fellow villagers and to the broader community, that um, that the preservation of these landscapes is a tremendous economic resource. So that's one strategy, is to say, if we destroy all the archaeological sites and we destroy all of the traditional agricultural terraces and we destroy all of the remains of the traditional parts of the village, we're kind of destroying the very resources that we could exploit for tourism.
Yeah.
Uh, we could exploit for even the agricultural production of various local and even wild uh, agricultural or botanical products, for example,
Mhm.
that could actually be to our economic benefit. And those are, in fact, more sustainable and longer term economic benefits than simply building an Airbnb or simply building a massive sprawling hotel.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's been very effective. But they've also on one level, they have simply made themselves and their fellow villagers much more aware of the deep historical significance of the village itself. And so there's a lot. I think that that's maybe the most important. Is not only have they demonstrated the economic benefit of preservation and public programming, but they have made themselves, in a sense, more aware um, uh, of the uh, of the deep historical roots, and they derive from that an important part of their own local identity,
Yeah.
um, and uh, and that's been very effective, and it's being replicated, I think, in a lot of areas of Greece.
Mhm. Yeah, that education is always important. Well, yeah,
Right, exactly.
thank you so much. That was all. I'm going to stop the recording here.